Today we are so glad to have Steve and Marilyn to come and share with us the ideas, the frontiers of mediation. And mediation, peacemaking, and how we live in the world is very important because it is filled with conflicts, and conflicts are not bad if we can use it in a positive way.
Well, I'll begin with the current trends in mediation. And I have to say that in the 2000s, mediation in the U.S., the national professional organizations all merged together, but we became so big that mediation got a little bit lost for a while. And I joined the board of that organization in 2006 and was president in 2007. And when I began as president, I said the one thing we have to do is not have mediation continue to be the best kept secret in the world, because it is a way for people to work on their problems and their differences by going to the root of where that all begins and learn how to resolve their differences in a very constructive way. And so we need to teach a lot of people about how to do mediation, and so this has been what's been happening. In 2011 and 12, those of us who do a lot of family mediation decided to reform our Academy of Professional Family Mediators in order to not have it become or continue to be a secret way of resolving family conflict, and have it become the way to begin in resolving family conflict. We hear a lot about alternative dispute resolution, and I believe that term started probably in the U.S., and it was named by the legal community, saying that mediation is an alternative dispute resolution process. However, when you think of alternative, it's usually marginalized. It's an alternative. Like in the U.S., we would talk about alternative medicine. And yet, we've learned that if we could begin with constructive conflict resolution, then the alternatives would be maybe the justice system, where people who cannot resolve their conflicts among themselves would have the justice systems in the various states and countries to impose resolution, which, by the way, is not necessarily the best way to resolve, because when people are not involved in the solutions to their problems, they tend not to necessarily carry out the solutions. When they're imposed, they're not carried out as constructively. So conflict in the world then. And international trends, mediation is continually becoming more and more well known. And one of the big trends, which I'll talk about later, is the professionalization of mediators. Steve.
All right. Good. Great to be here. It's been a good 6-7 days for us as I get to know the folks here in Singapore and how gracious and kind and friendly everybody is. I say to myself, well, they must have no conflict at all. But I'm sure that's not correct. I'm sure there is plenty of conflict. There's usually plenty of conflict to go around. And we had 2 days yesterday where we talked to the social workers, and they are very interested in using their social work skills more in a mediative way to mediate some of the family and parent-child and organizational disputes. This class that you're a part of, you of the public, should know that we've spent 2 days last weekend studying negotiation skills, and today we're going to focus on mediation skills, but it's all really the same. You can, you know, when you face conflict, you've probably got 3 choices. You can try to overwhelm your opponent. We say that that's a power-based approach to conflict resolution. That's certainly one way. Countries do that with each other. Families may do that. A family, a husband might say, I earn all the money, I will decide how it's spent. Or a mom might say, I raise the children, I'll decide what's best for them. Certainly it's one way of resolving conflict. Another way of resolving conflict is to define problems as who's right and who's wrong. And we've talked last weekend extensively about how that works and some of the disadvantages of that. One of the problems of a right-wrong approach, it's called a rights-based approach. One of the problems is that somebody wins, somebody loses. And that's not always the best way to resolve conflict either, because even if you win, if you have an ongoing relationship with the person you're in conflict with, it doesn't do much to help with reconciliation and resolving the relationship issues. So a second way we resolve conflict in our culture is to say who's right and who's wrong. It's mainly our legal system, and it's one of the, for me, I started out in that legal system. I was trained as a lawyer and practiced as a lawyer before stumbling upon mediation, and I didn't know at the time it would become my life's work, but I think the reason I left the practice of law is I began to realize that life's a little more complex than who's at fault and what can we do to create sanctions or punishment, who wins and who loses. That's a fairly simplistic way, and life, I think, is a little more complex. Nevertheless, we have a large system of courts and attorneys, and it's called the adversarial system, and it's another way of resolving conflict. A third way we resolve conflict is we've asked the question, what are your needs, what are your interests? And in the talk we're going to have this morning, we'll try to talk more about that, because when I first heard about an interest, well, what is that? What do you mean? But courts are beginning to realize the limitations of a right-wrong approach. I came across, in looking at the some of the websites for the Singapore court system, I came across a quote from, I don't know, I'm saying this, C.J. Sundaresh Menon, Chief Justice, no less your Chief Justice at the Family Justice Practice Forum in October of 2013 said, he's talking about the philosophy of family court. He says, familial disputes arise against a background carrying complex issues of past, present, and future that may not be disentangled by a simple declaration of who is at fault and how much that person ought to pay. And I think increasingly people within the court system are, and the public certainly, is beginning to recognize the limitations of the right-wrong approach. And in many ways, all of us know, I think intuitively, that a right-wrong approach may not be the best. And I'll give you a simple example, and then I'll turn it over to Marilyn. I happen to be the proud grandfather of an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old. Well, I have a 5-year-old, but we see the 11 and the 8-year-old much more regularly. They live not far from us. And I find that they are constantly, frequently they are in conflict, the two of them. And so the most recent one, just before we left, I was over at the house. I was all alone. I was keeping an eye on them. And the 8-year-old loves to build big Lego projects, as probably kids do around the world. And he had this elaborate Lego, and his older sister, Emma, came by. And she sat down, and she's going to add a few little pieces to it. And next thing we know, the thing's all apart on the ground. They're fighting, and somebody's crying, and so, you knocked down my Lego, and who, you know. So, as the grandfather coming in and hearing the commotion, I could, if I chose, I could, you know, say, all right, right now, stop, sit down. I'm going to take you into the other room. I've hired a court reporter. We're going to take some depositions. We need to get an affidavit about what happened. I want to find out who started this. I want to find out who caused this. And if I were really wanting to do it correctly, I would, as a result of this, I would install cameras, video cameras. I'd put video cameras in the hallway and in each room. And then I could say, well, I want to spend the next 3 hours looking at all the video of that project they were doing from all the angles so that I can determine who caused that, who was at fault for causing it, who's right and who's wrong, who's the person to blame for that thing falling down. And then I could say, well, that's going to be a little bit difficult, so I think I'm going to hire each of you an attorney, and we'll have a hearing in the next 3 months, 4 months out. We'll have a hearing, and you each get to testify about what happened this morning and how it got to the spot where you were fighting about who knocked this down. Well, you know, if that's the way I went about being a grandfather, you'd probably terminate my grandfatherly rights. I mean, nobody in their right mind would do that. We don't do that with families. What we do is we use that as a teaching moment. As was said earlier, it's an opportunity. Conflict is neither good nor bad. It's an opportunity for positive change and growth if we allow it to be that. And the only way we can allow it to be that is to move beyond the right and the wrong. So I'll say to Emma and Eric, I'll say, you know, we really need to talk about how the two of you can sit down and cooperate a little bit better, and I might talk to them about cooperation, and I might ask a little bit about what happened, and Eric might say, well, she sat down and she took over, as the 11-year-old usually does. She took over my project, and then the next thing I knew, it was on the floor, and we don't know who knocked it down. Probably got accidentally knocked down. But I would try to use it as a time where I would ask Emma if she understands how Eric feels about that, feels about his older sister taking over. And I would ask Emma how she might feel if he starts throwing things at her and hitting her, which he did. Not a good way. And we'd talk about that, and we'd figure out some way, I think, to make it work better in the future, because I'm using it as an opportunity to improve the relationship, and I'm using it as a teaching moment. I'm going to come back to Emma and Eric again.
So if you think about that, and then you begin to apply that to other conflicts, whether a lot of our work is in family conflict and helping people through a divorce. But if you apply those same concepts about the conflict to what's really going on, and whether it's a divorce or whether it's Northern in Ireland and the Irish Republic, whether it's warring groups in Africa, if you take those ideas and begin to apply them in all of those kinds of conflict, what we're really doing in getting to those underlying needs and interests is, in a sense, getting to the bottom of the conflict. John Paul Lederach is one of our wonderful thinkers in the U.S. on conflict and international conflict. He is a Mennonite, which is a community, a Christian community, and they do a lot of work in peace work, creating peace. So one of the things that he says when he goes into warring communities in Africa is that people will say, well, how can you possibly mediate with those people? And he said the first thing he has to do is help them imagine the enemy as their friend. That means you have to really get down to some common ground about those two people. What do they have in common? What are some shared beliefs? What's important to them? And then you begin to build the discussion so that they can begin to talk about the conflict at hand, but they're doing it from a different perspective because they have a new understanding of each other and where they each come from. And that's really what mediation and constructive conflict resolution is about. And I emphasize constructive because conflict resolution can be any kind of conflict resolution. It can maybe even be war as an attempt to resolve conflict. Doesn't work very often, but that could be considered conflict resolution. What we're talking about is constructive conflict resolution, where people are actually coming to settlements and agreements, their agreements, based on their interests in getting out of those top-level disagreements, which are the positions they take against each other, and breaking those down to figure out what's at the bottom of all of this. It's belief systems, it's misunderstandings, and if they can get there, then they can begin to build up and come up with better solutions that are constructive, that will work in the future. So, how to attack problems, not people. I think John Letterick's idea is that you have to imagine that enemy as your friend. You have to find, I always say, you have to find something in that other person that you can connect with and you can appreciate. And you have to really work hard at finding that sometimes. But that's where we need to go to begin to imagine that person as our friend.